One nation has finally won a seat in Australia's House of Representatives. This victory is not merely a domestic policy shift or a routine election upset. It represents a critical strategic variable that forces the United States to recalibrate its entire Asian pivot. The real stakes involve the fragility of the AUKUS security architecture when domestic populism overrides alliance cohesion. By the end of this analysis, you will understand how a single populist seat can introduce high latency into long-term defense planning and why the traditional metrics for predicting Australian foreign policy have suddenly collapsed. To understand the magnitude of this event, we must first look at the mechanics of the Australian parliamentary system. For decades, the stability of Australian foreign policy relied on a predictable two-party dynamic. The coalition, comprising the Liberal and National parties and the Labour Party, have historically agreed on the core tenets of the U.S. alliance. This consensus allowed the United States to plan long-term infrastructure projects and security guarantees with a high degree of confidence. One Nation, an anti-immigration party with a platform often described as Trumpian, has now broken that pattern. Their victory in the fairer electorate demonstrates a failure mode, where the two-party preferred metric, traditionally used to validate coalition stability, collapses when anti-establishment voters bypass the coalition's preference deals. This effectively breaks the alliance cohesion logic that underpins the AUKUS security assumption of predictable Australian foreign policy. The surge in One Nation's regional base reveals a supply chain vulnerability in the Australian political architecture. Local demographic shifts, analogous to legacy system technical debt, are now overriding centralized strategic directives. This forces a recalibration of the U.S.-Asian pivot from a bilateral security guarantee to a reactive containment strategy against domestic populism. The historical data from electoral datasets spanning 1972 to 2019 indicates that One Nation's current trajectory represents a systemic drift rather than a transient spike. This suggests that the U.S. strategic planning model must now account for a high-latency domestic political environment, where alliance commitments can be unilaterally renegotiated or stalled by a single populist seat. Quick resource note: I keep a curated set of Amazon search links in the description for books, gear, and tools relevant to this channel's topics. Some are affiliate links, so I may earn a commission at no extra cost to you. Please consider supporting the channel by using those links if you find something useful. Consider the specific mechanics of this new reality. The collapse of the Liberal Party's polling in South Australia mirrors a distributed system failure where the central node, the coalition, loses consensus with regional nodes, the voters. This creates a security architecture where the United States cannot rely on the operational continuity of the Australian government to execute long-term AUKUS infrastructure projects without constant domestic political revalidation. The absence of real-time adoption metrics complicates the assertion that the Asian pivot is now strategically recalibrated. Without benchmark results linking voter sentiment to legislative voting patterns on defense treaties, the argument relies on extrapolation rather than hard data. The critical insight here lies in the distinction between electoral victory and legislative power. While One Nation's breakthrough signals a shift toward protectionism and ethnic nationalism, the available technical datasets lack granular data on this specific recent electoral outcome. This creates a critical evidence gap for quantifying the immediate impact on foreign policy alignment. The historical context provided by the R package and 2016 blog posts suggests that while One Nation has gained traction, its influence remains constrained by the structural realities of the Australian parliamentary system. Holding two seats in the lower house does not equate to decisive policy control. However, the presence of a single seat introduces a potent warning signal. The lag between populist electoral gains and actual shifts in national security doctrine means that the immediate fragility of AUKUS is overstated if viewed as an immediate collapse. Yet, the potential for unilateral renegotiation or stalling remains a tangible risk. The U.S. must now treat the Australian government not as a monolithic partner, but as a system where a single populist variable can introduce significant friction. This friction manifests as high latency in decision-making processes, where every major strategic initiative requires constant revalidation against a shifting domestic political landscape. The fragmentation of the preference flow is particularly dangerous because it bypasses the traditional gatekeepers of foreign policy. In the past, if a voter was dissatisfied with the coalition, they could still direct their preference to Labor, maintaining the bipartisan consensus on security issues. One nation's rise disrupts this flow. Anti-establishment voters now bypass the coalition's preference deals entirely, creating a scenario where the government's ability to ratify or sustain complex international agreements is weakened by the very existence of a populist voice in the chamber. This is not just about immigration policy, it is about the reliability of the security guarantee itself. The US-Asian pivot was built on the assumption that Australia would remain a stable, predictable partner. That assumption is now under strain. The structural reality is that holding a seat in Parliament allows one nation to act as a spoiler, not a kingmaker. They do not need to control the government to cause delays or force concessions. They can simply raise the cost of every policy decision related to the alliance. This dynamic forces the United States to shift from a proactive strategy of deep integration to a reactive strategy of risk mitigation. The security architecture is no longer a seamless partnership, but a complex negotiation where domestic politics can stall or alter the course of international commitments. This systemic drift suggests that the United States must now account for a high-latency domestic political environment. The lag between electoral gains and policy shifts means that the full impact of this populist surge may not be immediately visible in foreign policy outcomes. However, the potential for disruption is real and growing. The absence of real-time adoption metrics complicates the assertion that the Asian pivot is now strategically recalibrated. Without benchmark results linking voter sentiment to legislative voting patterns on defense treaties, the argument relies on extrapolation rather than hard data. The key takeaway is that the fragility of the AUKUS security architecture is not a result of a sudden policy shift, but a result of a structural vulnerability exposed by populism. The United States can no longer rely on the operational continuity of the Australian government to execute long-term projects without constant domestic political revalidation. This requires a new strategic framework that accounts for the high latency of domestic political environments and the potential for unilateral renegotiation. The victory of one nation is a warning signal, not a confirmed strategic pivot, but it demands a fundamental recalibration of how the United States views its most critical alliance in the Indo-Pacific. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I am a one-person team working hard to make each video better than the last. Subscribe if you found value. It is the best way to show support. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. See you in the next video.